This podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not medical or legal advice. Always follow your local policies, procedures, and protocols when functioning in your respective profession. Additionally, the views expressed by the speakers and owners of this podcast are their own and do not represent the views of their respective employers. Listener discretion is advised.
Alert Medic 1 response.
Ken, Josh, and Mustafa here. Welcome back to the Alert Medic 1 podcast.
Alrighty, BJ, I know you told me to call you BJ, but I got to introduce you at least. Dr. Miller, we're super excited to have you on the show. I've been looking forward to this. So, BJ, if you don't mind, just introduce yourself and tell us what you do.
Sure. Yeah, Mustafa, thank you. It's nice to be here. My name is BJ Miller. I'm a palliative care physician, hospice and palliative medicine physician, and educator. My career, spent a lot of years at UCSF, practicing and teaching there. And moved out in the community, did some work at a place called Zen Hospice Project for a long time. Then worked on a book called A Beginner's Guide to the End. Simon Schuster published that in 2019. That's out in the world. And then more recently, my partner Sonia and I started a little company called Mettle Health. Mettle being METTLE, mettlhealth.com, which is basically a response to the pandemic. It's online palliative care counseling and coaching. So yeah, that's me. That's my work in a nutshell.
Yeah, I was first introduced to you when I watched the documentary Endgame on Netflix, which I would recommend anyone in medicine go watch. I mean, I was so moved by it. I actually ended up emailing you, and we had a good conversation because it at that point I hadn't really had an exposure to medicine from that frame of reference, right? Mm-hmm. And it was so moving to me. And I know we talked about it a little bit, when we spoke on the phone on Monday, but it was certainly impactful for when, so my dad passed away from small cell cancer in 2019, and just seeing that process and then experiencing it, right? There's so many points, right, that we could talk about it as healthcare clinicians. So I'm really excited to, have this conversation. I want to ask first, how did you find yourself in this space?
Well, for me, my going into medicine at all it was not a lifelong interest of mine. It's not like I didn't come from a line of doctors or whatever. And it wasn't on my radar really until I became a patient. I got injured sophomore year of college in a pretty spectacular way. And that experience, coming very close to death, coming out of that with some disabilities, I was very much changed by that experience. And of course, part and parcel of that whole experience was my time with healthcare. And it was, so that whole experience really opened my eyes both to what medicine does so beautifully well, and also what medicine maybe where it still has a thing or two to learn. So I was sort of just turned on by the whole experience into the medical world. And so my going into medical school was just really a response to that, trying to make meaning from my own experience and put it to use. I kind of had this feeling when I was a patient, like how cool would it be if my if my doctor walked in the door and looked something like me, missing some body parts or was using a wheelchair or something like that. I just felt like exercising our experiences as patients in the world, the clinical world or in the caregiving world, is a beautiful kind of a full circle. So that took me into medicine, Mustafa. And then I was going to go into rehab medicine. Figured that'd be the most useful place for me to be. But through a long series of sort of disillusionments and experiences and changes in my own ways of thinking deep into medical school, I was actually going to drop out of medical school. I was going to finish medical school, but I was going to drop out of the match and just let this whole thing go. But I got talked into doing my internship here, and And during that year, I got exposed to palliative care. Just kind of dumb luck. I was doing an elective on it in the field and fell in love with it immediately. And so retooled myself, got back into the game, and headed for internal medicine residency and then palliative care fellowship, and never looked back. So that's a little bit how I ended up here. Lots of details in there too we could talk about, of course, if there's more interest.
Yeah, I mean, so much, right? The big thing, maybe we should start with is, in medicine, what do we do right and what do we do wrong in terms of palliative care and really death? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we could spend many hours on that question. It's a big one. I think in general, the healthcare world, the medical piece, the medical driving force in healthcare, I'm alive. It saved my life. There's no two ways about that. I had electrical burns, very serious stuff. And, there's no two ways about it. I mean, medicine saved my life. So it does acute sort of interventional kind of work, life-saving work. You guys know this from the front line that you are on. Acute care is pretty dang good. It isn't fun. It doesn't smell good. It doesn't feel good in a lot of ways, but we're pretty darn good at acute care. I think where healthcare really struggles is what to do with folks it can't fix. What about those of us who aren't, curable? When we enter the ranks of disability or chronic illness, you can feel the shift. The funding is not there. The research interest isn't there. The sort of the thrust of the medical world, it feels like something of a sort of an orphan or some second class place within the medical kind of hierarchy in the medical thinking. So one way I put it is we really struggle when we're beyond being fixed, when we can't be cured. How does medicine help us live with these conditions? How does medicine help us get the best care possible so we know what could be done is being done? But also when you're dealing with something like this over time, I mean, if you break an arm or something goes wrong, you're in the hospital for a week, it's hell, it's hard. But for the most part, everyone can kind of hold their breath and get through that. But if you got to go back out in the world and live with disabling conditions, trauma from the experience, a whole new suite of emotions and tweaks to your psychology, your sense of identity, these are huge issues that affect what it means or what it feels like to be a patient or a loved one of a patient. But you won't find much. Those issues don't have much purchase within the medical world, within the healthcare world. So that's kind of hanging out in this bundle of chronic care over time. That's something that we just have not figured out. The healthcare system hasn't really committed itself in that direction. We're still too smitten with our technology. We still would rather look at CT scans and talk to patients. We'd still rather shirk the idea that, death could happen at any moment. We just defer that conversation endlessly. You can note it in our medical system of education. 100% of our patients die, but there's not much discussion of how to manage that or how to handle that. So anyway, I'm going off a little bit here, Mustafa, but those are some thoughts. I mean, we could talk for hours about that, but I'm curious, as I say those things to you from your own personal experience with your father or yourself or in your professional life, I wonder how my comments register with you, if you see it differently.
No, they resonate so much. My father, he had always said that in my language, right, not in English, but he said, I don't want them to mess with me, right? Saying that, I'm trying to get the right translation right, but he didn't want to be messed with, right? He didn't want to he got chemo once, and then they had trouble getting access again for his second round, right? And he's like, I'm done. He's like, this is it, and he passed away in a year. So no, it resonates with me. The question that kept coming to my head was, I wanted to ask you next, why do you think that is? But then another thought came to my head, and that thought was, is it because we're afraid of our own mortality, right? And in a collective sense, we just don't want to answer that question of what do we do next, right? So I want to open up to the team in case you guys have any thoughts, but that's where my head went first.
Well,
Yeah.
I would add to that, I would use the illustration of when you guys put Chris Hemsworth in the aging suit, and so here's this physical specimen, right? That's admired the world, or around the world, and you put him in this suit where the physicality is limited, and by what was it 2 days or so, he's ready to get this thing off, and he is so relieved to have this thing off. And
Cody, you should just mention what you're talking about, because we weren't recording when you mentioned what it was.
So on for you folks that have the Disney Plus or National Geographic subscriptions, you can check out this series. It's 6 parts, 5 or 6 parts, maybe more.
Yeah, I think it's 6 parts.
Where Chris
Maybe
Hemsworth
5.
puts himself through 6 parts.
Yeah, I think so.
And Chris Hemsworth puts himself through, and the team puts him through all of these different challenges, and some of the first 5, let's say 6 episodes. So the first 5 episodes, that part of the world's been pretty well unpacked. Of how do you control your stress responses, and how do you overcome some psychological stresses and things like that. But the one that stuck out to me the most was the last episode, and it's confronting aging and the end, which I thought was a very poignant way to end a series called Limitless. And that there actually is a limit. So, how does one cope with that? Where I was this person before, I was this man before, and now the time has caught up to me. And how does one cope with that? To kind of tie in a little bit to what Mustafa's talking about. I don't want people to mess with me. I don't want people to, I don't want people to just, I don't want to be tortured the rest of my life. How does one cope with that being reality?
Yeah. No, so I have some really good questions here, Cody, and I like the frame around Limitless. That suit kind of got Chris Hemsworth in tears, more or less. So we had to, poor guy,
it did.
We accelerated him by about 50 years physiologically, and it was no fun. And of course, it's natural. So we have this tension. There's this medicine, does a zillion things. We're interfering with Mother Nature's plans all the time with medicine in the medical world. So our relationship to nature is a very interesting one. We are nature. Humans, we are too. And yet we have this capacity to muck with it in spectacular ways, in some ways, to great effect. When you want to change your reality, and when medicine can do so, it's wonderful. But part of the problem is it keeps trying to change your reality, even if it can't. And you as a person, as an aging person, as a sick person or whatever else, are left to kind of try to get used to this thing that you can't change. Meanwhile, you got signals coming from these experts saying that you should eat more spinach, or you should do this, you should do that, somehow implying that you're going to somehow beat aging and beat death, implying that with their language, implying that death is a failure, succumb to his illness, lost the battle. This is the language we use. In medicine, we even use this phrase, he failed treatment. Like, what? No. If we have to use that failure word, well, treatment failed him. So it's a mindset issue that we're bumping up against here. And to Mustafa's point, none of us, I was just about to repeat a fallacy. I was going to say none of us wants to die. The truth is, there are all sorts of fates worse than death for people who are actually in these shoes. And at some point, death can become a source of peace. So, this is complicated, nuanced things that shift in any one of us over time. And medicine as a system doesn't move well with people over time. And it has this old tape that death is the enemy, disability, enemy, illness, enemy. So we are literally setting up a situation we are put to made to feel that we are at war with ourselves, war with reality, war with nature. And that has myriad repercussions. They're all over the place. You can sort of play them out. So, and I think if you're on the receiving end, if you're just living your life, like let's all put our professional hats down for a second. There's all sorts of things that we're asked to live with, even in the prime of life, quote unquote. Maybe things that we would love to change about ourselves that we just can't. There's a maturity and a wisdom to facing the things that you cannot change. There's a beauty in that. And there's an activism to bump up against things that you can change, but it's like the Serenity Prayer and Alcoholics Anonymous or related 12-step program. This is an ancient idea for us to kind of find our place as human beings. What can we change here, and what is it on me to change? Where is it on me to accommodate this reality versus the opposite, the other way around? So there's a lot of stuff in here what we're talking about, and some of this stuff we shouldn't think our doctors are going to somehow make all this work. This is some of us on us as human beings to keep prying our eyes open and keep paying attention to a full spectrum of reality, a full notion of reality. Full notion of reality includes suffering, includes death, it includes illness, it includes things that we cannot control. And we don't love that message, but the sooner we face it, the less we'll suffer, and honestly, in my experience, the more we'll thrive. Like I counsel people around the end of life issues all the time. And one reason I do that is it's almost like a harm reduction. We all know that death isn't easily met in a hospital system. And so if you plan for your death with an advance directive or whatever else, that advanced care, you line up what you want, what you don't want, that's great. That's going to spare you some unnecessary suffering at the end of your life. So one reason to do that is so we hurt less than we have to. Or we don't, we hurt less. Period. But another reason to do these kinds of things, like our conversation here, fellas, like it turns out that the sooner we as human beings dare to look at this bigger reality, then the sooner we're going to learn from it, the sooner we're going to find interesting parts of ourselves that we didn't know existed. We're going to feel our interdependence and our relationship to others. We're going to feel the connection between us. All things that have ever lived are going to die. We are connected to everything in this way through this detail. So the sooner we turn our attention to these hard facts, not only will we hurt less, but there's all sorts of amazing wonder and awe waiting for us in that bundle of stuff too. And we cut ourselves off of it, off from that stuff, tragically. So anyway, I just went off on some sort of tangent there, but I can't remember now if we've even answered the question that was on the table. You guys know?
No, that's great.
That was awesome, though. No, we are always okay with tangents. That's kind of the point of the podcast, right? Cody, go ahead.
No, because it sounds almost like aging is a natural progression of health coupled with an identity crisis, right?
Beautifully said, Cody. Yes.
Would you say that's
Beautifully
accurate?
said. I would say that's very accurate. Yes. Yeah. And try talking to your doctor, your clinical team about your... Oh, sorry.
No, please.
So keep going.
I was just going to say, try, that identity, that's a huge issue here, Cody. A huge word, and it's something we're all wrestling with all the time. Like, who am I? What does this mean? Now that I've lopped some limbs off, who am I now? Who do I want to be? These are huge questions that are really rich, and I wish we were a little bit more honest about it. I think we all tend to sort of, I think we're kind of, I'll just speak for myself. If I'm just kind of reading the cues from society wants me to be sort of firm and fixed and, recognizable, always myself, always this thing that I am, my identity to be kind of fixed, knowable, and recognizable, That's what people want. You can know that I think about this with some of my friends who are used to be like the class clown. And when I see him, Joe, he's trying to be a serious adult now, but we keep making him be the class clown. And that's how he has his social identity. So he keeps trying to oblige us, but we're not letting him become the guy he is now. So we do this to each other in all sorts of ways. But anyway, I started to say, like, if you got issues, questions about who are you now, what is the meaning of all this, these are the most common questions in any clinician's office, but they're the least commonly answered or addressed. So this is another thing that happens in the medical system. The things that you're thinking about versus the things that the doctor are thinking about can be a huge gulf in between those two things, as to make you feel very lonely when you're in the patient's shoes.
I'll come back to this later, but Ken, what do you got?
Yeah, what don't I have? I started out with one question. I've got like 4 or 5 now. I'm going to pick just one, and then we can go back to you, Cody. And the one I'm going to ask is a really heavy, hard question. I'm not necessarily asking your opinion on it, but more the general medical ethics about this, because this is becoming a bigger and bigger issue, especially internationally. This is becoming a big issue. And that is the question of fates worse than death and ending unnecessary suffering. And the question of the natural dying process versus, is there ethically something that could or should be done to maybe speed that process along?
So, yeah, you're right, Ken. You're asking. That's another doozy, big question. These are beautiful. We could spend a lot of time together on these. So, just for your listeners, what you're pointing to are, we call these aid in dying laws, medical aid in dying. What used to be called physician-assisted suicide, but the word suicide was problematic, so we've kind of changed how we talk about these things. But medically assisted dying or aid in dying is what we're talking about here. Or one piece of what you're bringing up, Ken. So real quick for the listeners. So I think in 10 states now, first was Oregon in 1997, but now I think we're up to 10 states that have laws on their books that make it legal for a physician to prescribe lethal medication to a patient who is terminally ill, has 6 months or less to live. In other words, sort of in the hospice zone, hospice eligible zone. Can think clearly for themselves and reproduce their wishes to die, to hasten their own death, in writing and in verbal communication, with a time delay, so the people have time to change their minds. So there's all these sort of legal stipulations to qualify for aid in dying, and then there's a process to it. Like the person has to be able to take the medicines and ingest them themselves. So we can talk about a lot of the challenges around the law, but that's basically the law. And so in these 10 states, you can hasten your death. You can take the reins and say, I'm dying soon. I want out now. I'm either suffering too much, or I find this a meaningful final act in this life of mine, and to go ahead and get off the planet. So one piece of your question, Ken, gets at this law. In states that have these laws on the books, it's been generally a positive thing. There have been concerns around a slippery slope, that we're going to make it too easy to die, that medicine shouldn't be in the business of sanctioning death, only protecting life. I find that one to be a fallacy, because life includes death. They're not at odds. They are related. Can't separate death from life. So that one doesn't hold much water for me. And the slippery slope argument hasn't really panned out. It's not like all of a sudden there's a bum rush of everyone wanting to get off the planet. But still, it's a hot question on the moral plane, religious plane, and increasingly laws like in Canada and other places are liberalizing the law to include people who aren't terminal but have an intractable mental illness. Some places even allow people younger than 18 to hasten their own death. So anyway, there's a law. It's a big purview for some of the legalities around it. Does this getting at to what you wanted to talk about there, or is there something we could talk about the moral and ethical plane, not just the legal one? But what's at the heart of your question?
Yeah, the heart of my question was really the ethical aspect of it, but the legal plane is absolutely fascinating as well. So wherever you want to take this, I'm more than fascinated with the discussion. So
yeah,
please.
Yeah. Well, I think, Ed, so let's just, so we can talk about the law, the problems with the law, and the good side about the law. There are details in there. I feel for the legislatures. This would be a very difficult thing to write a law about, and really filter out filter out the right stuff and keep in the right stuff, and it's not easy. But let's put that on the shelf for a second. Let's just talk about the ethical plane. So each of us gets to say, bioethics for the last 50-ish years, we have the basic 4 tent poles of do no harm, actively try to do good, beneficence, justice. So what do we do with limited resources? And then there's one more. Autonomy. So autonomy, justice, beneficence, and do no harm. These are the 4 basic principles of bioethics, and any one issues are filtered through those tenets. So in this case, bioethics would say, oh yeah, so I have autonomy as a human, as a person. I have personhood. I have autonomy, and if I'm in my quote unquote right mind, if I have decision making capacity, then I get to say I have autonomy. What's right for me is up to me to say. Now that one might be held in tension, but to some people with the idea of do no harm, and if I'm actively hastening your death, is that not harm? That's an open question, but some people would make that argument. So that would be a counterpoint to the autonomy. So anyway, this is how you can move your way through medical issues. I would say for my money, but I'd love to hear from you too, Ken, and anyone else here, guys. But for me, my field tried to stay neutral on this law for a long time. Actually was against this law for a long time, as were Disability Rights Group. I'm a proud disabled community member. And I remember I was stunned at first to hear the concerns that the disabled community had around this law. But I came to understand it. So the basic gist here was, so many disability advocacy groups are against these laws. Because, I thought they would have been for, because it's sort of about, hey, it's my body, my rights. I thought that would be the sort of leading edge. But what a lot of groups, advocacy groups, are pointing out is to say, well, hey, if we're blessing death, and if the route to hastening death, and when we make death an okay option, is to say that when your life has become so hard, when you're suffering so much, and people invoke like, well, because I had to be on these meds, my face swelled up and I no longer am attractive, and who would want to live this way? And you invoke these kinds of situations. And so for those of us who live with physical deformities or disabilities, you're saying like, wait, what? Because I look funny, that's a reason to die? Like, is this the message we want to send each other? So in this way, the concern ethically would be that we're sending a signal that if your life's too complicated, and if you're overwhelming our social safety net and services, and your doctor is too busy to deal with this, you know what? You're right. Let's just get you off the planet. That's a hard signal. And also the one that's got my attention was, how can we honestly, where's the uproar over people not getting palliative care? We know if suffering is the issue, palliative care has technology to help you not suffer nearly so much. And yet many people in this country don't have access to palliative care. So why are we going right to getting people off the planet? Why are we not building access to palliative care? Why is that not the source of our advocacy? So that makes some good sense to me. But of course, if I'm talking to a patient, I don't want to hold up their own desires because I'm waiting for systems to change. It would be hard for me to say, I'm so sorry, Mrs. Jones. I hear your wish to die. I'd love to help you. But if I help you die, imagine the signal it's sending to random people out in the world. Or, I don't like the way that smells with the systems issues I'm working on. So ultimately, I have found my way into being supportive of these laws. But I don't pretend it's an easy conversation for all the reasons I just said. But what do you guys think? How does it come up for you?
Yeah, so I can only speak for myself. I don't speak for Mustafa or Cody.
Sure.
But over the past 20 years, I've seen what I feel is an incredible amount of human suffering. And, my wife's an RN, and she's seen a great amount of human suffering as well. And, it's a conversation we've had, and all I can do is speak for myself and say, I think unnecessary suffering is unnecessary. And if there's a way to make things easier for people and there's no alternative, then why not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's ultimately where I land too.
I think it's fair, just as recently as sorry, Dr. Mill, go ahead.
Oh no, Cody, I was just agreeing with Ken. Please continue.
Just as recently as last night, I was on a shift and I was in a nursing facility, and kind of how you do, guys, when you're walking toward the room that they're funneling you toward, and you kind of catch glimpses in the corner of your eye, and you wonder, are these folks living or are they just existing? And if they had a choice, would they choose this life for themselves? I think this Ken, this question that you've posed is very deep, and it's so good, but it should question us. It should cause us, as on the pre-hospital side, when we go into these places, when we go into these facilities, to maybe approach this through a little bit of a different lens, and that for the most part, I would say, because we hate 100% right in medicine, so I would say 99% of these of the individuals who are living there in these facilities for a long term, but actually would not choose to do that if given the choice. Yeah. I think it's important that we remember that.
This resonates with me too. I don't know if even the guys know this, but I had growing up, my grandmother and my aunt lived with me, and my aunt actually had. I've said this story before. She had a series of strokes that ultimately led her to have to stay in a skilled nursing facility. And I remember visiting her. My mom and dad would visit her every day. I would visit her when I could, but to be completely honest with you, this is probably not the best thing to say, but it became very hard for me to go because she progressively lost her ability to speak, to take care of herself, and the hardest part, and it's not about me, but the hardest part for me was knowing that her brain was still working, right? So I remember times where she would try to speak to me, and I know, her head or brain was working fine, and it was just so tragic. I mean, and she passed away in that nursing home, right? And then fast forward to calls that I run, where I run similar people, it still gets me a little bit, because I remember this, this vibrant aunt that lived with me, that grew up, was and the immigrant story. So no, I'm with you, Cody. You walk in there and you see these things, and I don't know. I'm kind of rambling here, but it's just there when it comes back to the ethical or I forget what the new term was, BJ. I won't use the suicide term, but I don't know. Yeah. I honestly haven't given it much thought. Aided physician aided dying. Yeah, I haven't really given it much thought. I don't know. I don't want to say I have an opinion, because I don't know. There's this part of me that runs from trying to make an opinion, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, I appreciate everything you guys are saying. I love. First of all, I just want to thank you. It's nice to be with folks who are willing to. Sometimes the professional in our shared professional world. Sometimes the sort of neutrality and dispassion that we expect is often not very helpful, and sometimes is a shield we hide behind. So I'm just really, first of all, thank you, all of you guys, for speaking plainly about your own experiences. It's really helpful to hear. It's really important to hear. We are human beings besides our sort of professional roles. So and I appreciate your note, Mustafa, about your aunt too, and also not having much of an opinion, because these are complicated issues and they do require a lot of thought, and it's hard to make it, depending. I was going to say it's very hard to make a sort of an absolute declarative statement about aid in dying is always right or is always wrong. To your point, Cody, there's no 100% here. We really have to dwell in a very case by case kind of scenario. And we also have to keep an eye on, or get to keep an eye on, sort of systems and structural issues. So one thing I just want to throw in here, like, those nursing homes you guys are referencing, even the nice, quote unquote, nice ones, they're kind of a hellscape. No one wants to be in these places. Why is that? What the hell are we doing? Why is that industry so hamstrung to not create something better? This is all over healthcare again. The patient experience gets sort of left to sort of, it's third on the list of concerns. First, you got the research imperative, then you got the clinical imperative. Really, last up is the patient's experience, which is another question for all of us to ponder. Is that the system we really want? I have some thoughts there. But let me just say, to circle back on this question about aid in dying, if we're holding up that this is appropriate for folks when the pain is enough, well, what does it mean when our systems are the source of that pain? That's a very important question. This is not God-given pain. This is human-made pain, some of it. And so I'm back to, yes, we can support people, individuals, finding their way to their own maker in the kindest way possible. And that doesn't mean we stop thinking about systems and trying to improve care wherever we can. Because the way things are now, I think I'd probably want to hasten my death too. If I were dependent on a nursing home kind of environment, I would have strong feelings about that. And it bothers me and gets me, my hackles up, that we, with all our resources and all the love and care in our big system, that we haven't found our way to creating care that we'd want to ever be part of or receive ourselves. So anyway, there's another mouthful. Cody, were you about to say something?
So I wonder if it's kind of a thought experiment, if you guys will indulge me. But could you tell us how we could do better for these folks that are in these hellscapes? I think that's the best way to put it. I mean, even the best ones, right? It's not living. But it was almost as though if you go back to Limitless, what you did with Limitless and Chris, I feel like this was like the perfect way to set an individual up, a new patient in the most perfect circumstances. Your experiment, right? And granted, it wasn't. We're making you guys are having a grown man in fantastic physical and mental shape kind of confront mortality. So how do we do better for our aging population? Let me rephrase that. Here's the question: using your experiment with Chris as the framework, how can we do better for our aging population?
Well, thank you. I think that this is a good segue, because I think when it comes down to it, for a lot of us, the things that really are helpful are not fancy things. Kindness, eye contact, introducing yourself as a human being. Hey, I'm Cody. I'm here for X, Y, and Z. I just want to say hi, or whatever else. Simple. If you're having a conversation with a patient who's using a wheelchair or in a bed, sit down, be at their eye level. It's just basic etiquette, basic respect. And not to shame any of us, I find myself weirdly, I look past people in wheelchairs all the time. My mother uses a wheelchair. I still do it. There's some habits here, but so I'm not. My comments are not to shame anybody. It's just to acknowledge all of us. To your point, Cody, we could all probably do a little bit better by each other. So anyway, back to some things that we can do. Introduce yourself. Say hi. Look at ask their name. personalize them, humanize them. That's the force you're up against, dehumanizing reductive forces. So part of the answer here, Cody, is find a way to being more help them re-expand, help them humanize. So again, names, eye contact, sit down, ask open-ended questions if you have the time. And for God's sake, do not gaslight. Do not pretend the situation is something that it's not. Don't force a smile when you don't have one. Be real with yourselves and each other. I'm sorry, Mrs. Jones. This place looks like it could be better. I must be hard living here. But you know what? I'm going to be, next time I'm through here, I'm going to say hi, or, whatever it is. Just not pretending, oh, you're going to get better, Mrs. Jones, or no, this is great. Look, there's a cat, or, whatever. Just this gaslighting thing, what we do to each other, we don't acknowledge each other's realities, is, for my money, one of the sort of biggest, sort of newest conceived negligences. It's a kind of negligence. So there are other answers to your question there too, Cody. We can get some structural question answers too, but those are some thoughts.
Can I piggyback on your question, Cody, or do you have something else? Mm-hmm. No, do yours first, and then I'll drop mine. Mm-hmm. Mine's a better follow up.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. So it's a tough situation, and here too, of course, there's all sorts of, sometimes besides just a lack of awareness or a lack of engaging, sometimes that person's spitting at you and screaming and all sorts of things. So, there's some practical concerns here that come up, no doubt. So I don't want to be cavalier, but in general, one thing, when you're dealing with a patient who's living with dementia or something that's interfering with their intellectual capacity to comprehend, to be aware, to engage, one is to watch your own pity. So if you're having trouble looking at this person, thinking about, oh my God, how does this person live? And, like if you're going down your own shame spiral, like, boy, I would never want to be in those shoes. I can't even look at this poor guy. Pity is a name for this. Pity, for those of us in the disabled world, we can smell it a mile away, and it's not good. It looks a little bit like sympathy, but it's different, and it feels different. So one is to just check your pity at the door if you can. So that's one clue. The other thing here too is to not, continue to try to correct someone who's in the throes of dementia. Oh no, Mr. Jones, it's not 1912, it's 2025 or 24 or whatever. And you just start to send these failure signals to the person over and over again. Once you're clear that the person is demented or is not able to communicate with you, can just let them just be in the moment with them. They're in a state that a lot of people work for years in a meditation practice to achieve, which is they only have the moment. So anything you can do, a little touch on the arm, maybe some basic primal human things and you can read the person every time. Is it calming them down or is it agitating them? And just let that be your moniker. Let go of this wider view of reality and just be with this person in their own little world. And quit trying to correct them. So those are some etiquette cues. Again, I want to acknowledge it in emergency situations, 911 calls found down. Some of this stuff may not land as being possible, but I think you're finding your way to treating everyone you're coming across.
I don't know. I'd say quite the contrary.
Good.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah. But I got to say, sometimes I've found that those help the chaos, right? I'd say the little human interactions help bring a lot of control to the otherwise chaotic scene. The 90-some-year-old patient that, has fallen, has an obviously broken hip, right? Or the patient that's, 70-some years old, and you show up there on 2 liters nasal cannula and they have an oxygen saturation of like nothing, right? I mean, oftentimes it's, and on top of that, you may have some dementia. It's those human things that they can connect with, not necessarily the clinical things, right? So,
Exactly.
man, I have a patient in front of me right now that I can think of that, wow, this was probably 2017. Now that I think about it, that I distinctly remember the conversation and the tone that I had, helped in an otherwise chaotic situation where the staff at the nursing home were useless, to put it nicely. I cut you guys off. I apologize.
No, that sounds great.
Yeah,
and again,
so,
these are
are you
this is
good,
not
Cody?
high tech stuff. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me, guys? There's a little delay. Can you hear me all right? Yeah.
Yes.
I was just saying,
we got you.
good. Good. I mean, these things, you're right. I mean, these are basic things that don't take a lot of time. They do require, I just want to name something else here for all of us. And when we're sitting now, you guys were not riding out around the rig. I'm not in the ER. I just want to acknowledge, like, what we're saying here, one way or another, is we're just encouraging each other to be more human, be real. Reality includes hard stuff. Don't pretend otherwise. And this is just the deal. And I'm not going to run away. That's the charm. And this thing called bearing witness, I want to just name that. That is something we should all get really good at. That just means I am actually seeing you. Cody, Ken, Mustafa, I see you guys right now. I see how you are, who you are. I accept you. I am with you. I respect you. I'm not trying to change you. I'm not trying to manipulate you. That very sacred thing of bearing witness is a holy state, not judging, seeing, but not judging. That, if you can practice that, that's something a lot of us might do in church, frankly. That is a sacred act. That's but that is magic, and that is human element at its most basic. And I hope for all of us, before we die, we have some moment where someone looks us in the eyes and says, "I got you, buddy. I hear you. I see you. I am here right now." And you guys can do that in those calls. But I started to say, sorry, I'm a little verbose, but I've started to say, I want to acknowledge that it sounds like great as we're sitting here today. Yeah, be human. Be really human. Bring your own stuff to the mix too, because that's the source of your own suffering and that's the source of your empathy. So be real. Yes. And I want to acknowledge that we work in jobs and systems that make that very difficult. Even if I don't have a boss, what I could do as a medical student, I'd have attendings telling me to, quit being so emotional, basically getting the cue that I needed to turn into a robot. Be not human is the sort of medical culture. We know that doesn't work, but we also know it's hard to avoid. Numbness is a very real thing. I don't need to tell you guys. You're on your 20th call of the day or whatever else. Just being that simple human character that we're talking about may just feel out of reach. I may be so crispy. I may be so burned out. I may be so exhausted that that numbness is the only thing within reach. So I just want to name that it's this simple and it's this hard too. And so this is why we all got to kind of keep an eye out for burnout. And we all got to keep pushing our system to improve itself. So working within it isn't such a chore, torture even.
Yeah, absolutely. Cody, you're going to have to pop out and pop back in. Yeah. And then, Ken, all you, buddy.
Okay. Yeah, so I suspect the answer to this question is going to be very similar to the previous one Cody asked you, but I think I'd be remiss if I didn't ask a man of your experience and expertise. One of the things that we do in EMS, something that I did very frequently when I was an EMS officer in the jurisdiction I worked for, is give death notifications and be in a situation where we may work a cardiac arrest for half an hour or more. Our efforts are unsuccessful. We're now faced with, explaining the situation to the family, which, I mean, hopefully we've been doing the whole time, but what is the best way to deal with a grieving family, to explain to them the death process, that their loved one isn't going to be coming back, that it's not like the TV shows where the paramedics show up, save the day, and everybody goes home happy?
Mhm. Yeah. So, boy, some more good stuff in your question here too, Ken. One is, I think, for all of us here, again, a meta theme for our conversation is uh, sort of this fuller reality, right? If we're dealing with life and death, like, how do we do justice to this huge thing that we're working with, this big life thing? What the heck is it? It's huge, it's powerful, it's wild, it's many things. And try as we might to kick the hard stuff out, the hard stuff just persists, including grief. So I just want to make a case here that grief is normal. Grief is good. And grief shows up even before the death of someone. Grief shows up at the time of diagnosis. There's like anticipatory grief. We anticipate the loss. I look at my old cat right now, and I know he's not long for this world, and I'm grieving even though he's still alive. So you really I would encourage all of you all to read up on and dig into, be students of grief, because you will start understanding it, and it's everywhere. Again, it's the loss not just of a friend or a patient or a loved one. It's a loss of identity, loss of an object we love. It takes many shapes. And especially nowadays, and especially if you're empathic at all, we can be in touch with all sorts of pain and suffering all over the world. So most of us are probably in some amount of grief most every day. So all the more reason to be aware of what grief is and how it's like an altered state. It can really affect your judgment. It can affect how you're thinking and feeling, etc. So grief is big, and we get into trouble when we try to avoid it. So I want to make a case for grief here as being a good part of our job. And to do it well, to do our job well, we need to be pretty facile with grief. Your other alternative is just try to numb out and not feel those feelings. And as we've already discussed, that'll land you in a even worse place, a harder place where you'll be no good to yourself and others. So grief is important. So that's all preamble to get to your question, Ken. So how do you do that when you just, delivered a death notice to someone, let the family know that this person isn't going to make it or just died? One is, I know there's forces. When I found myself in those shoes, I try to reduce it, simplify it, so I can get through it as the bearer of the news. But I have found that it's not a time for polish. It's a time for realness. A family, if they can feel your anguish telling them this news, that generally helps than some very polished, refined, sparkling answer. So I wouldn't memorize some perfect thing to say. What might register with one family is going to be exactly what's wrong for the next family. I would instead encourage you, one, get your head in the game by normalizing grief. This is life. This isn't a detour from life. Okay, so I'm in the ballpark. Okay, now I show up. I need to be kind. I need to be clear. You expect that a person receiving this news is hearing like 1 out of every 10 words you say. So clarity is a kindness. Simplifying the message, speak clearly. You might need to repeat it. You might ask the person, a family member, I'm so sorry, Mr. Smith. I know this is a crazy moment, but I just want to make sure you're hearing me. Could you let me know? You might even ask them to tell you what you just told them. I'm not saying that's always a good idea, but that's a trick to make sure it's getting through. Speak slowly. If you can, sit down, kind of remove yourself from the hubbub. If there's fire part folks going around, and maybe step aside. And if you can take a seat, do so. It doesn't need to be more time when you sit down. It feels like you're spending more time with someone, but it doesn't need to be more time. And then also having at the ready, like a checklist of things like, hey, you're going to need, here's the next move. The next thing that's going to happen is we're going to call a mortuary, whatever it is, have some list in your mind of how to advise them, what their next move is. You need to do 1, 2, and 3. But then lastly, I would say you put this vibe out, and you might even say it. Death is not an emergency. It may feel like a hell thing. You may need to get on to the next thing. They may want to be anywhere but there listening to you say these words. But any way you can say, you can slow it down. This is not an emergency now. This is done. We're here. Try to be present. Try to slow it on down. That generally helps. So does that make sense to you all as I'm saying that? Does that feel realistic for the situations you find yourselves in?
Absolutely, absolutely. The word that came to mind was I mean, there's so many things I want to say, which I'll get to, but you kind of, the term mortality checklist came in because we all do this. We just don't have it in our protocol, right? Like, I mean, we all know, I'm sure. I mean, Ken and Cody have pronounced a lot more people in their careers than I have, but in the middle of a resuscitation, you get the family ready. You introduce yourself, say, "Hey, my name is Mustafa Sadiq. I'm the paramedic that's taking care of your family member. This is what I see so far. This is what I'm expecting." Right? You give them an initial brief, and then you go back to the resuscitation, and then you try to give them as many updates as possible. And then at the end, generally for us, it's we hand over where we are. We hand over the body to law enforcement, and then. So it's interesting to have that checklist. That's huge because I imagine, and I'd love to get Ken's and Cody's thoughts on it. I imagine there's a lot of variability because it's not codified anywhere. And honestly, now that I think about it, I've been a paramedic instructor since 2017 and 2018, and Ken was my paramedic instructor. I don't know if we really define any of that anywhere. I don't think we do. And then I had a couple more thoughts on. And I had a specific question, and we talked a little bit about this when we chatted on Monday. In emergency medical services, there is a huge push, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm asking you for your opinion of being very deliberate in using the word "died" when telling a family member that or whoever that their significant other has passed away. And from my understanding, and again, Ken and Cody, correct me if I'm wrong, that is to ensure that there is no doubt in the family member's mind that their loved one is deceased. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that as someone completely outside of emergency medical services that is not, has zero input, to get your thoughts on that specific word and your thoughts on everything else I said. Yeah,
it's a good point. Let's get specific here. So language matters. It's really imperfect stuff, and I say that a lot of times. By the way, back to the question, Ken, that you put about grieving families and how to handle it. I will often say, I don't have the words. I know this situation is unimaginably hard, and I don't have any language for this, but I am here with you. I just want you to know I feel you. I'm here with you. That it might be a time for a hand on the shoulder. So anyway, just to say, language, I find it imperfect. It's inherently imperfect, and it's very important to use it thoughtfully. So one point is just to note its imperfection, so you're not caught trying to make the perfect word. But back to the point you're bringing in here, Mustafa. Yes, in general, I learned, and I also teach people to be leery of euphemisms. One of the ways we sort of we obscure this death thing, we hide it in all sorts of ways, and we layer up sort of confusing language around it, and that seems to inoculate us a little bit from its truth. But you're dealing with people who are meeting this truth. So not talking around the point, not being indirect, not using euphemisms is generally a good idea. Speaking plainly. I'm sorry, your husband or whatever has died. That there's a clarity there, and that's good. Now, I would say, like we've said a couple times today, I don't think of this in absolute terms. It's not 100% of the time. You can only ever say dead or died. culture has a lot to say with how people handle death. And so if you know that the person deceased, if you happen to know the way they talk about death, then being culturally appropriate can be very helpful. So if there are some people who say passed away, and if you happen to know these people and you know that they're going to understand what that means and that feels right, if that's culturally specific, okay. So there are exceptions to this rule of always use the D word. But in general, I would share this idea. Like, let's be plain about this truth. We're kind of having to compensate for several generations of obscuring this line, so we have to kind of be pretty brutally honest about it. But I don't think of it in absolute terms. There are exceptions to be made. What you don't want to be saying, want to be very careful, depending on your own belief system, like, he's going to a better place or something like that. That can be really offensive if that person doesn't share your belief system. And also that can be confusing as hell if little kids hear that. Like, what do you mean going to a better place? There's a better place in here? Why am I not going to this better place? Whatever. So, but that's my 2 cents here, Mustafa.
No, I really appreciate that. We don't really tell people, we don't teach our clinicians how to deal with family, right? I think we all learn. So when I say we all, paramedics, we all learn by seeing, right, how others do it. I remember the first person I pronounced dead, and I won't go into the details on the recording, but it was a deep moment for me. Growing up, you see things on TV, and it's the fancy time of death, blah 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 blah, and then I'd seen it as a BLS provider, as an EMT, when I wasn't the one doing it. But then suddenly it was me who had led a resuscitation. It was words matter. So now I think about unsuccessful. Yeah. So I mean, the patient wasn't revived, right, and they had died, and I remember, so we sort of go on our radio and we'll say dispatch, paramedic, whatever, priority 4, and priority 4 around here means they've passed away, and that's their time of death. And in fact, I could tell you, so many calls where it's specific tragic events where you kind of wish you weren't the one there, because it's a tragic thing that, then of course law enforcement takes your name down, your license number down, blah, blah, blah. And, no one really teaches you how to do that. And so I really appreciate your perspective, because it's kind of a lot of the things that we do, we've talked about at EMS, we've kind of we learn by doing. We're taught the medicine, but we're not really taught the human side of things. So I don't really have a clear point on that. More so, I just appreciate what you're saying, and I thank you for saying it.
Well, and I think that's a really good note here, Mustafa. I have a lot to say about, at least about medical education. There's a lot of ways it can be improved upon. Undeniable. True. And I also think it's on us too. Like, I can't imagine my nephrologist is going to teach me what it means to be a human being. I think that's something that we have to, yes, medical education could be more humanized. It could be humanized, and that would be helpful. But I think what you just laid down here, Mustafa, is really an important point. And I use this language with med students because med students, they're very ambitious. So sometimes I have to wind them down. Or if I name anything homework, then I know it'll get done. So I will often say, hey, your homework is to deal with your own shit. Your homework is to call grandma. These are the things I want you to do, besides just bury yourself in a book again and hide behind knowledge. You want to get from knowledge to wisdom, it's going to be through dealing with your own life and dealing with a bunch of shit you can't control and you wish for otherwise. That's your teacher. So I'm saying this to you fellas, just for us all, encouraging us. These conversations, this is our work too. Let that be part of our homework, and let it be part of our occupational pride that we address these things. I would love it to find its way into paramedic and medical education, but let's not wait. We don't need to be proven. I think we know from our own experience, it doesn't need to be proven to us that being a human being is both a remarkably wonderful and remarkably difficult thing, and it is the thing that generally heals. So we don't have to wait for the teachers. We can do this.
especially when people like Ken are the teachers. So we kind of
Yeah,
beat the game on that one.
exactly.
Hey, I think that's this is a good transition to, unless Ken and Cody had something. I had a question that I wanted to bring up. So how do you deal with your own mental health then, right? Because I can't imagine it's easy, right? Especially, I mean, Endgame. As paramedics, we deal with, in Maryland, it's the MOLST form, which I actually pulled it up, the Maryland Medical Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment, right? So you show up and it's a DNR-B patient, which is like or MOLST-B patient for us, right? But sometimes they're not just anything. How do you help yourself, as someone who is so close to death?
Well, it's an open question, and it's a work in progress, Mustafa. And one thing I do is I keep changing my job because I burn out and I move to another piece of it. One time was doing all clinical work, then moved to more teaching, and then did some writing, and then moved from the academic out into the community. And blah, blah. So part of my self-care has been, for all the systems issues we've touched on today, and as infuriating as they can be, I keep moving as part of my self-care. That can be unrealistic for many of us, but that's one thing that I have done over the years, to stay fresh and keep looking at this work from multiple angles and stay interested in it. But one is to say, too, besides that, it's like, to give ourselves, like, we have all signed up to lead a certain life of a certain kind of profile of distortion. We all know that life includes suffering and death, and that's normal. Yeah, I'm sure you guys would agree with me on that. But we have signed up to spend our working hours at a certain piece of that spectrum. So we are butting up against suffering and mortality in uncommon ways. So for me, it's a proportionality issue. So when I have downtime, I'm kind of literal. I counterpoint all that sort of extreme, that kind of what I call distortion, because of my frame of reference gets so skewed to that piece of life. But as we know, that piece of life is different from a lot of the rest of life. So for me, my self-care is often getting out into the woods, getting back to nature, getting away from sort of a lot of the human sort of made up problems, and getting back to nature, the thing that is the cause of all this, but also has all the answers to these big riddles. So for me, it's getting out on my bike, on my motorcycle, getting sort of on the other spectrum of life to counterpoint my distortion of the end of life and suffering that I'm hanging around. But another is to continue to in a daily way, not take the bait, not separate myself from these things, not separate death from life, not separate vulnerability from strength. That's a big one. We talk about vulnerability as though it's a weakness. I beg to differ. I think vulnerability is our strength. I mean, what's so great about a rock? It can't be hurt. It can't be moved. We are fleshy humans. We are affected by this life. In fact, it brings me to another point. For my own self-care and also for the care of others, I've come to realize that being affected by another person, by my own life, being moved by life, is really beautiful and powerful. I used to try to, not cry, not show emotion. I have found that quite the opposite. When I let the emotion show, it's both better for me and for them. So be affected. The goal here is to not be not moved. I think our self-care here, guys, is rather, no, sign up. I want to be moved. I want to be affected. And I want to learn how to move with my reality so that I can be hurt and I can also heal. I can be sad and I can get through it and get to joy. My own notion of health has to do with, I used to think of my own health or strength as being, how far away could I get from trouble, or far away could I get from pain? Now I think of health as have equal access to sorrow as I do to joy, equal access to my tears as to my smiles. That tells me I'm right in the middle of life. That's where I want to be. So tears are not my enemy. Sadness is not my enemy. Getting stuck in those states, that's a bigger problem. So I want to get good at falling down. I want to get good at making mistakes. This is my self-care. Daily life gives you plenty of opportunities to practice. So that's where I go. That's my schoolroom.
You know, it's interesting. I remember showing up. It was a couple. They were, very quite. They were old, in their 80s, and I had to pronounce one of them, and then I had to tell the spouse of however many years that their spouse had passed away.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember it was right around when my dad had passed away, and in the room, it was a separate room where we had them, and law enforcement were there, the other fire department people were there, and everyone's kind of just waiting and watching me tell this person, right? And I remember my voice cracked, and I was so disappointed in myself at that point, because I remember, my voice cracked, and there's a ton of sheriff's deputies there. One of them just shot me a look. And and again, it's not on purpose, right? I mean, it's just, there's other stuff going on in everyone's life. But I remember back then thinking, man, like, what the hell are you thinking? Like, what are you doing? Like, I genuinely consider that a failure on my part. And quite frankly, I really haven't thought about it since then. I think I might have, I don't know. But it's interesting, your perspective. I don't know. I'd love to get Ken's and Cody's thoughts on this, because I think we're kind of expected to be these like stoic, hard-ass, flat, affected people, and then just move on, and anything else is just, you're not cut out for the job.
Yeah, so I think that's a very interesting thing you just brought up, Mustafa, because all I could think when BJ was talking was something my therapist had truly just beat into me with a hammer when I was like in the midst of my PTSD stuff. And that's, you are not a robot. You have to feel emotion. You should connect with people emotionally. You must feel these things. And it's so important to have that level of emotional awareness and emotional intelligence that you can feel this, or else you will get messed up. I mean, that's a reality. There's a reason we feel this stuff. There's a reason we have to learn to process this stuff, because it's normal. And if we don't, then yes, we get messed up and we get things like PTSD. And that's it's part of the learning process of being a human being, to understand how to cope with these emotions and to express them in a healthy way to other people. And it's not weakness that your voice cracked. It's your human nature. It's your connecting with that patient, or the patient's spouse, I guess I should say. That's what that is. That's that human connection. That's reality. That's empathy. That's feeling the pain of that situation, the sorrow that this couple of 40 years, one of them just died, and they're never going to be together again. And that's horrible. That's heartbreaking. Of course your voice cracked. You're a human being. You're a decent human being. That's all I have to say on that.
to keep going, like to riff on it just a little bit, is I've been reading a book about a PJ, Roger Sparks. And there's this passage that's like stuck out to me, and it's hit me about 3 or 4 times this week. And I think this is where it's supposed to come up, is that like what fucks people up is not allowing the experience to change you. That's what fucks people up, whether it's like PJ, like with your personal stuff that you've had to overcome. And Ken and Mustafa and all of us, like just from what we do with our careers, what we deal with personally, it's what fucks us up is not allowing the experience to change you. We hold on. It's an identity problem. And we hold on to who I was versus who I have to confront who I am now, but I want to be who I was before. And this, and it touches so many different things, right? So PTSD from a near-death experience, like being in combat or whatever, it's like I was scared and I refused to acknowledge that. I refused to acknowledge that I was scared for my life, and I'm not going to let that change me. I want to be the guy I was before I got scared. I want to be the guy I was before I got hurt. I want to be the guy I was before I saw this awful thing happen to this person. And there's this constant budding of brain cells, heads, whatever you want to say, of who I was versus who I am now. And we just have to, I keep going back to the episode, the Limitless episode, but a lot of the things like with the chief, when he lost his brother and having to confront who he needed to be, right? He had to step up and be the chief, or the Kung Fu master, right? When he smashed his knee and he was like, well, I can't do Kung Fu anymore, but he discovered a new identity in Tai Chi and being able to share. And what I thought was what I think is even more important now, in conversations like this, is having community and being able to relate to folks who and connect to folks who have overcome all of those things. It's like, yeah, I had an identity crisis too, man. And this is how, I beat it. This is how I became who I am now. And I let go of who I used to be. Yeah.
Well, and I'm proud to be on this podcast with you guys. This is really, I'm so moved, speaking of being moved, by what you all are saying. I am so encouraged. And Mustafa, yeah, you did just right. That I'd give you extra points for that crack in your voice. That is that empathy thing. I would imagine if we could find that spouse that you were talking to, we would be able to establish that was probably a poignant moment for her, if it was a her. And that was a moment she realized she was talking to a fellow human being, and her spouse meant something to a stranger enough that stranger was moved. That's good stuff, man. That is healing, good, connected stuff. So that would I would high five you and hug you if I were your teacher. And we have a cultural issue in medicine, perhaps in paramedics too, that this old thing of having no feelings and being unmoved and all that stuff, it does, if you dig in, if you look under the surface of those guys' lives, there's usually a bottle of booze behind it, or a failed series of relationships, or something else that cracked because he wouldn't, So to this point, there's a new thing to be proud of in this world that we're trying to create together here, that we're being affected is a good thing. That is a living thing. So I don't want you guys to die before you have to die. And one of the ways we do that is we numb out or pretend to not feel certain things. That's a death before you got to die. So don't take that path.
Boom. That was
wow. Deep. Because I'll tell you right now, all three, Ken, Cody, and myself, we have so many people that we know that have already died. I'll tell you what, it's and a lot of us that came pretty close, and then we're able to claw back. I'll tell you that too. Ken, I appreciate you brought up what you said about your therapist, because moving without getting into too many details, one of the worst calls I ever ran in my career was Christmas Day, and talking to my therapist about it afterwards, it was interesting because I had a whole different process on how to manage these things, right? Where, which included actually talking to these guys immediately after, and then talking to my therapist after, and it feels more in balance what you're describing, BJ, of being in tune and having access to that. I think it's human nature when you're first at, just like if I was burned, if I put my hand on a stove, right? Or if I was cut my hand on a knife, I have a visceral reaction to go away from pain. Yeah. Just like physical pain, emotional pain, I imagine the visceral reaction is to move away and clamp down and be that robot. So I think the instinctive nature is to do that. But I think how I describe it, so BJ, just to tell you, I'm not in the field anymore. I'm in an administrative role, and I still work, actually where Cody works, part-time still, just to keep my clinical skills up. But one thing I've noticed is when I was full-time in the field, I had developed this scab. The way how I describe it was a scab that was kind of a shield to be able to protect myself from the highs and lows of like the emotional stuff, right? And now I've been out of the field full time since January of 2019, and now that I've been working a lot more, I've learned that I don't have that scab anymore. But that's also not necessarily a bad thing, because I started with a therapist in August of 2022. So now I have a better capacity to deal with these things, right? And I have a better handle on my emotional compass, right? So I'm just saying this to say that, for the folks listening out there, that I know someone's in a hole right now, right? Someone's, probably on the back end of a 24 that's exhausted, that's listening to us to, just get away from it for a bit. I think everyone on the podcast and everyone on the show would heavily recommend to, make this that moment you go get help, right? I think all of us on the show have had that moment, and we encourage you to do that because it's changed my life for the better. I don't know where I was going with that, but yeah,
that sounds good to
it's
me.
important.
Amen. Yeah. Amen.
Yeah. I do have one more topic, but I want to make sure I give it to Ken and Cody before, because mine's kind of a weird one.
I only have one
I'm
more
not shocked.
thing, and it's kind of a weird one too. I was going to save it for last. It's what we discussed in the meeting.
Ken,
we had.
I know what you're going to do, so you go for it, and then I got a weird one too.
All right.
To line things up a bit.
All right, Doctor, I must ask this question because you are the most eminently qualified person to answer this that I will probably ever talk to in my life. And as a lover of all things strange and woo, I must ask, what science's current understanding of the near-death experience is?
What is science's? Wait, say that question again, Ken. What is science's?
What is science's understanding of the near-death experience? So I almost died. I saw the tunnel of light. I met with my deceased loved ones. What happened in the brain there? Or was it in the brain? I don't know.
It's this. So I have a quick answer to your question, which is I have no friggin' idea. And I don't think anybody really does. I haven't looked up the latest science, but in this case, science would most certainly be theoretical. I don't know that we have the capacity to test and to know. So my sense is if someone comes at you with sort of an air of scientific certainty around what a near-death experience is, I would politely run the other way. I don't think we get to know such a thing yet. Maybe we will. But my guess is what's happening there is, I bet if we could, there's a big surge of interest in psychedelics these days, of therapeutic use of psychedelics. That's a whole other topic of conversation, but there's a lot in there.
You jumped my question. You
we're interested.
Yeah, that was literally going to be my question. So let's send it. Yeah.
Well, just to finish one and bleed into the other, my guess is DMT, dimethyltryptamine. Is that right? Dimethyltryptamine. DMT is it's the active ingredient in ayahuasca. You'll find 5-MeO-DMT in Sonoran toads, the acacia plants, all sorts of. So DMT is apparently in all living things in some amount, including humans. I would not at all be surprised of whether what we see there in the near-death experience, which is usually pretty consistent. That's one thing else to note. When people who have had these experiences, they describe something very similar. My guess is what's going on there is we are having a release of DMT, endogenous DMT, and it's kicking us into some connected conscious place. You could reduce it and talk and explain it away as a hallucination or of a nerve just in the throes of dying. It's firing off aberrant signals. You could make it sort of a meaningless piece of chaos of a brain trying to die. I used to think that. I don't think that anymore. I'm more apt to think that something essential is going on there, and that what dying really probably means is us letting go of this form that we're in and melting into some substrate that all life is shared by all life. It's probably something like consciousness. It's probably some connected goo of consciousness that we don't yet know how to test for or describe, but many of us have a sense exists. So, and I don't think you're going to get any more scientific answer than that, Ken. Not yet. So, does that answer your question before we head over to Mustafa's?
Yes, that was probably the most beautiful, perfect answer you could have given me, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome, buddy. Okay.
So for my reference, the DMT, this is what like Rogan's been talking about, and like Tyson went and did it, and Tony Robbins went and did it, and Ride the Toad. Okay,
I don't know. I literally just said that. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, that's toad medicine is what some people call it. Yeah.
That's right. It's on my list.
It's certainly on my list too. It's interesting. I sat next to one of the nicest people I ever sat next to on an airplane one time, and we were stuck on the tarmac for a while. And I'll tell you guys the full story after we stop recording, because as we talked about this, I was like, man, this guy would be a great guest for the show because I've kept up with him. Former MMA fighter, right? Who professional MMA fighter, long story, but he talked about his experience with me. His experience with DMT with me, and I was like, I didn't believe it at all. And then I went down a rabbit hole, and I was like, holy shit, this is next level stuff. The reason I wanted to bring up psychedelics today is because, I'll start it off like many stories I guess I have today was with my experience with my dad, where as he came to the end, he saw his dad. Now, my dad came here with the rest of his family as a refugee at the age of 19 or 20. His dad had died at an even younger age in East Africa, and everyone I don't know. I didn't know this. My mom did, though, that he missed him a lot for years. Right, my dad passed away when he was in his 60s, and by the end, he could start seeing him, and it's easy in Western medicine, I guess, to be like, they're just hallucinating because they're close to, putting the period on the last chapter, right? So,
yeah.
But I don't know. And maybe this is just a comforting thing that came to me, but it certainly didn't feel that way, right? It certainly felt like something else. And I really appreciated what you said about, what you I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what you talked about, transitioning into another form. I can't help but think, okay, this is going to sound really silly, but there's a cartoon, there's a kid show called The Avatar, and then there's a sequel to it. But right around when my dad had passed away, this new one came, or no, maybe it was before, and the first couple minutes of the second series, they talk about how, the Avatar, after the show finished, did so many things, but then just as the seasons change, so did the season of the Avatar end. And I was like, I heard that when I needed to hear it the most. And you've said it a couple times during the show, BJ, where death is life, right? We can't, in healthcare, we cannot, in medicine, we cannot think of it as this failure. It is a natural end of things. Maybe we can facilitate our care so that our patients can approach it in a more dignified and painless way. But certainly it's not our job to just ignore it and consider it a failure. So my question about psychedelics was, and again, I've not looked into this at all, but there seems to be some whisperings of using psychedelics in hospice care to ease the transition. Is that a thing at all? And could you speak on that?
It is a thing. So there's a resurgence, I'd say, in the last, I don't know, a serious, sort of more public resurgence, say, in the last 5 to 10 years. Michael Pollan's book really kind of put a lot of this on the map for folks, and that was How to Change Your Mind. And I can't remember what year that was published in, but so last decade, there's a return of interest in psychedelics for serious therapeutic uses. It turns out, before the government got involved, was for spurious reasons, and scheduling medicines like LSD and marijuana for that matter as Schedule 1, having no therapeutic value. A lot of research was shut down in the 50s and 60s that had been very promising. So we're in this sort of second age where Western medical, Western scientific thinking is revisiting these medicines that have long histories in indigenous populations. These are medicines, chemicals that have been around for centuries. We're the new kids on the block. So one of the things that's funny going on right now is like sort of watching the white Western folks think they've somehow invented psychedelics. This stuff's been around for a long time. We're just returning to it as a above board therapeutic endeavor. So there's not been a lot of research until there was a lot of research in the past, then nothing for a while, and now there's new stuff going on. So my guess is we're going to learn a lot more in the next 5 to 10 years about how and when to use these substances. So included in very high up on most researchers' lists is using psychedelics for end-of-life anxiety. One, because end-of-life anxiety is very difficult to treat. It's a sort of an existential angst around meaning making and what has my life meant, and what you're dealing with regrets and all sorts of stuff, very poignant. And also because death is a little bit permissive. There's a lot of skeptics in this country who would say, oh, well, if they're dying anyway, compassionate use, we'll let them try this thing or that thing because they're dying anyway, kind of thinking. So for all these reasons, studying psychedelics for end-of-life anxiety is a very hot subject. And a lot of the data to date was studied in folks who have a terminal illness or, say, a chronic illness that will someday take their life, but they're all dealing with existential dread and anxiety and a real grip fear of death. Psilocybin was one of the drugs that most studied in this setting, and these folks, after one experience, one guided trip, and guided is a very important piece of this puzzle. So for your listeners, what's very clear is setting matters, pre-trip kind of preparation and post-trip integration, very, very important to keep this therapeutic. So it's not just willy-nilly taking a handful of mushrooms and running around the woods. But anyway, the data that is showing is that these guys, after one trip, had completely changed their relationship to mortality. It completely undid the script of loneliness and fear. They felt part of something. They felt part of a whole that was unkillable. So even when they died, they had this sense that they were going to still be here, part in some energy, some way, part of this universe, because you kind of can't leave the universe. So feeling all these points of connection, not as an idea, but a felt experience. That's what these chemicals can help you actually feel what we're talking about here. This is not an intellectual exercise. So anyway, there are data to suggest that these experiences can be very helpful for end-of-life anxiety. And like I started to say, one trip, and they talked to these folks months down the road, and there was a durable effect. So you can imagine from a kind of a chemical point of view, a huge potential need for these medicines. And we just don't have anything else. So in my past, when someone came to my clinic who was afraid of their own death, I could talk to them, and that was helpful. I could give them Valium and basically put a wet blanket on their nervous system. But that's very different from being able to now point them towards a guided experience where we're not just making them less anxious, we're making them more connected, feel more alive, more a part of something. That effect is enormous. And I have never, as a physician, if I have that tool in my toolbox, I'm a much happier camper. So we're all waiting for the studies to come through and all the work at the FDA to happen so that we'll be able to prescribe these experiences. I think that's coming in the next couple of years. And I think one of the first places we're going to see it play out is in the end-of-life spectrum for all these reasons.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. That was a really good cap, honestly. Ken, Cody, any closing comments before I give it to BJ?
No, that was An amazing interview. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, you guys.
Yes,
I'm
sir.
so
Thank you for
impressed.
coming on, man.
Yeah. Oh no, thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I am so impressed with this conversation that you've made my day. I think we're all fighting for a world that actually can contain the experiences of a real life. And so talking with you fellas today helps me believe that I'm not the only one fighting that fight. And I love hearing sharing your own experiences. So thanks for going there with me. You've done your listeners a big favor too.
We really appreciate that, BJ. This has been tremendous. I think it's probably been one of my favorite interviews. This has been fantastic. We live in a world where, I don't want to beleaguer this too much, but a pharmacist of all people, she told me one time that, we were talking about thoracotomies of all things, right? Like open chest massage. And this was when I was very young in my career. And she said, sometimes you should remember that that's a person you're doing that to. Obviously I'm not in a clinical area where I would have done that, but we were just talking about it. And that has always stuck with me as a large, as a surrogate for, remember there's a person underneath everything that you do. And, sometimes there's so much to be said to that, but I think this conversation helps our listeners, remember that. I'm sorry, BJ, go ahead.
I echo what you're saying, Mustafa, and I would say just to make sure for you, for me, for everyone listening, that we include ourselves in that there's a human being underneath this thing. So when you're looking yourself in the mirror, make sure to say that, give yourself that same rights and responsibility and sweets of grace and all the other things that come with it. So yes, I agree with what you're saying, and please include yourself in that.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. So BJ, don't go anywhere. We're going to just close out the show and then we'll stop recording. But don't go anywhere. Ken or Cody, who wants to close us out?
I can, unless Cody wants to.
Ken, you said it first.
I will. All right. Everybody, thank you for listening to Alert Medic 1. Please check us out on social media, Instagram, Facebook. Leave us a like, a rating, a review. Please join us again next week for another awesome episode. May the 4th be with you. Good night, America, and good night, world.